Hello and welcome. I'm Father John Roberts. Thank you for joining me on this wintry February day where we're going to pick up on the Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to St. Luke, the 9th chapter, the 28th to the 43rd verse. This is the story about when Peter and James and John are going to go with Jesus up to a place where they're going to be visited by two other people. So listen as I read the gospel. About 8 days after Peter had acknowledged Jesus as the Christ of God, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with them. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. Just then a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." Suddenly a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all who were astounded at the greatness of God. The Gospel of the Lord. Once when I was a small boy, we went with a family vacation to the state of Maine, and we stayed with some friends of ours, and we decided that we would make a day trip of going over to see the scenic Boothbay Harbor. You have to take a boat to get to this particular island known as Monhegan Island. And it's a beautiful place. The water's deep, it's cold. And we were there in the summertime. And I'll never forget that while we were there and looking at all these lobster pots that were stacked up 20 feet tall, and we were wearing our yellow rain slickers because it was raining or dewy the entire time. Moisture everywhere. Never seen anything like it. But next, what I saw was something that I will never forget. I was with my father, and I was a distance of about 20 or 30 feet away from him. He could see me, I could see him. And there off the bay came a breeze, and it blew in this fog that was so thick that I could no longer see him. But I remember his voice and him calling out to me, and with that, I would go and find safety. It was a fearful thing. I was very scared at that moment by being consumed by this fog and not knowing where to turn or where to go. But I listened for my father. I think this was similar to the feeling that Peter, James, and John had when they went with Jesus. And there they were consumed by this cloud. And they heard the voices of Moses and Elijah, and they saw them. And then the cloud was upon them, and they could not see any further, but they felt God's presence, and they heard his voice. How often have we also experienced a time of great darkness where we were overshadowed and we knew not where the Father was, and we searched and searched to find him? This brings us to the second part of the gospel, where the man who has a son is begging for Jesus to heal him, and he begged the disciples and they couldn't. He was in a dark place. A cloud had overshadowed him, and he didn't know where to turn. It's like that as well in our own congregations. When there are times where the clouds come upon us, the rain comes down, and we can't see our vision. And yet God calls to us and says, follow my son. Keep him in your sight, even in the midst of that cloud. Search for him. And God always leads the faithful in the right direction. This day, you may be struggling with a place that is unfamiliar. You may be struggling, wondering, where is God? Where is Jesus in my life today? Looking for the law, perhaps turning to the law, such as what Moses would represent, or turning to the experience and wisdom of those who came before, such as the prophet Elijah, are areas that you may turn. But Jesus uses both law and prophet, the wisdom and the order in which God has created, in which to give us guidance. This day, listen to his voice, peer through the fog, and allow for God to continue to call out to you and show you the way. Share with me a time in which you were consumed by a great cloud. That could be a figurative statement, a time where you couldn't see, but you relied heavily on Jesus to lead you through it. I'm sure that you in your life have such an experience. It may be good for you to share that with us. Please don't hesitate to do so. Share your faith, share those experiences, and let people know that God continues to speak through the cloud. As always, go forth in the name of Christ.
We praise